old versus budget new. Which one of these is actually the better purchase? In this video, I'm gonna be going over a trend that I've noticed on Amazon where I'm seeing used renewed phones being purchased probably at a higher rate than budget phones brand new. So this is gonna be the Samsung version where I'm gonna be comparing the A16 versus the S20. So let's see how these two phones compare. For starters, the price is obviously gonna be pretty close because you're talking about a about to be 5-year-old phone versus a brand new budget phone. And so I paid $170 for the S20, but I would recommend going a little bit more to closer to the $200 range. And then I paid around $2 and change for the A16. So in terms of price, they are very comparable and you have some room to play with when it comes to the buying a renewed version, because you can go with the S20 Plus or a better condition one, or you could actually play around with that. Let's go over the design and build quality. So obviously the A16 is gonna have the modern design of phones and keeping up with Samsung's separate 3 rings, while the S20 has a single piece of glass that has all of the lenses beneath it. So it's already a different design, and the S20 was probably one of the more boring designs in my opinion, but it's not all about the looks. When we look at the build quality, there's a bit of a difference here, and it's in the S20's favor. The A16 doesn't feel cheap at all, so I'm not gonna say that, but it just doesn't feel premium. It feels okay, I guess like we would expect with a mid-range phone. And the S20 has that premium feel. Even though the buttons are not flattened out like modern phones are, and the sides aren't flattened out, it has a premium feel to it overall. One of the examples that I can give here is that the A16's buttons, they are flattened out, so they're modernized, but they feel a little bit spongy and not as clicky. So it feels like there's play in there. With the S20, it's more responsive, like a more sure click that you can feel, and that just, you spend money when you're designing a phone to do that, and it shows. One thing with the S20 and pretty much any phone that you buy renewed is that I would kind of exclude the water resistance feature from it, because a lot of these phones are opened up and they get a brand new battery, which is, you kind of want that. You know, better to have good battery life than to have the same original battery, which, you know, 4 years down the road is not going to be that great. But in doing so, there's this risk that they didn't seal it properly, and so the water resistance might not be up to par. So yeah, you're losing it from the original S20 specs, but it's going to be in line with the budget phones anyway, since most of them are not water resistant. The next thing I want to talk about is the battery life. The S20 doesn't have a small battery in today's standards. When you're looking at Samsung, it has a 4,000 milliamp hour battery, which is the same size as what's found on the S24 and S25, I think S23 as well. The difference is that the chip is going to be less efficient, so the battery life is not going to be as good, but I don't think it's going to be that much of a difference where you can't last a whole day, especially if you're not a super heavy user. But in terms of battery life, this is where the brand new budget phone is going to win, because it has a 5,000 milliamp hour battery on the A16 here, and that's going to last you all day. Plus it has a weaker chipset, so most likely it's going to be sipping through the battery at a slower rate than the S20, especially if you're pushing it. So if I do a head-to-head on battery life, it's clear that the A16 is going to be the winner on that one with 1,000 extra milliamp hours of battery. But is it worth giving up that battery life for the premium features that come with the S20? So a closely related feature is the charging, and in this one the S20 jumps ahead because the speeds are the same, so that's a wash there, but with the S20 you get wireless charging, which you don't get with the A16. So this is where getting that pre-owned premium phone is going to come in handy, because you get these premium features like wireless charging. Of course, you're also going to get the features like reverse wireless charging, which on this phone, having a 4,000 milliamp hour battery and it being a bit older and more energy hungry, probably not the most useful thing, but it has it if you ever did need it. Before we move on to the next category, if you're enjoying this video or finding it helpful, leaving a like and subscribing will really help this channel out. Now let's move on to the next one. This next topic is one that I never really think about because I'm usually testing the more premium lineup of the new phones, but every time I try a budget phone, it rears its ugly head, and that's the smoothness and operation of the OS. So it's not that the OS is not smooth, but more like the phone can't really handle the smoothing effects that Samsung has put into the phone. I would venture out to say that this is going to be an issue across all brands, but for now we're focusing on Samsung because that's what I have here to compare. If it were to happen once in a while here and there where you navigate and it's a bit choppy, or you swipe up for the gesture but instead of going home it scrolls up or presses a button on the screen you're on, if it just happened once in a while, that's fine, but it happens quite a bit with budget lineup phones, at least in the Samsung ecosystem. In the contrary, using the S20, which is about to be 5 years old, still provides a very smooth experience. And that's more important in everyday usage than pretty much any of the other things that I've noticed. And this is how I know that. When I used the S20 to test it, it wasn't bothersome at all. It had pretty much all the features that I normally use, maybe missing some of the AI features and things like that, but everything else is pretty much there. There were things like the fingerprint reader being a bit slower than, quite a bit slower actually, than the modern ones, but you could get over that pretty easily and you get used to the speed of it anyway. You just have to keep it there for a little bit longer so it can read it properly and it'll open up. And once you open up, you're running smoothly just like any other phone. With the A16, I actually tested it for less time because I would just get frustrated after a while and I would want to change phones. I didn't have that feeling with the S20, just with the A16. The fingerprint reader is not on the screen, it's on the side button. And it was about the same speed, if not a tad bit quicker than the S20. So that's fine there. But once the phone unlocks and opens up, that's where it becomes somewhat annoying to use. And actually what I've done with some of these budget phones that I've tried out, with Samsung specifically, is that I switch it from the gesture controls to the button controls. And even though you still get the lagginess look when it's trying to go home with a smooth effect, at least you don't have the issue where you swipe up and instead of going home, you're scrolling or touching another button. So that's one way to kind of get around it, but it's just not a smooth experience when you're going this low in price. Now let's move on to the screen specs. In terms of brightness, they're both almost exactly the same. So you're not gaining or losing anything there by going either which way. In terms of resolution, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, specifically with the S20. So the A16 has a full HD plus, which is good enough, even though it's a bigger screen. So you'll notice that a little bit more because it gets lower on the pixels per inch rating, but it's good enough. And the refresh rate is actually at 90 Hertz, which is already at that point where it looks pretty smooth. Smoother than the chip can actually allow the animations to run anyway, so it doesn't even matter. With the S20, when I saw the specs, I was impressed. You know, you could get the Quad HD with 120 Hertz refresh rate, but then when I got the phone and started messing with the settings, you can't do both at the same time. So it's probably just because it's an older phone. So you either have 120 Hertz with Full HD Plus or 60 Hertz with Quad HD. It's a smaller phone, so the Full HD Plus is going to give you a very crisp image. So I actually went ahead and used the 120 Hertz refresh rate. And the phone's actually really smooth and never stuttered, and it just behaved perfectly. In my opinion, it's a much better screen experience than the A16, unless you're watching videos. For that specific task of watching videos, the A16 is going to be better just because of the overall size. And when looking at a few of the other screen related specs, really the only thing that stood out to me was the bezels, because the A16 has the budget bezels, which is 1, uneven, not symmetrical, and 2, larger than the premium lineups. And then with the S20, you have the curved screen, which reduces the bezel, at least the look of it. And so the top and bottom bezels are going to be a little bit larger, but they're still smaller and they blend in pretty nicely. So it's going to make it look a bit more premium, and it's going to give you a bit more surface area for the screen without having to give you a bigger phone. Which, when you look at it overall, either way, the A16 has the bigger screen. Alright, so the specs on this next one is going to be like a pretty much a no duh moment. So the camera specs on the S20 are better than on the A16. No surprise there. As far as the main sensor goes, I would actually say that they perform fairly evenly when it comes to pictures, but that's where it ends. Ultra wide, the S20 looks better. Telephoto, the S20 actually has one, even if it's not to today's standards. And that's just talking about photos. When we look at video, the sensors don't even matter because the processor is where it stands out. I imagine that it's because of the processor that the A16 is limited to 1080p recording. It's not the sensor size, because with 50 megapixels you can record up to 8K. I'm not saying that I expect 8K from an A16, but I'm just saying that that's not the limitation. The S20, you can actually record 8K, which it has a crop and it's not as good as the modern phones with 8K, but it's there. But more importantly, you have 4K, you have stabilization, you have all these great features, and it comes out better than with the A16. There are a few other quirks with the A16's camera, which I noticed with other Samsung budget phones, which one of them is that you can't zoom in on the ultra wide. You're stuck at the base zoom, which is fine because it's not gonna be very good anyway. So you jump from the ultra wide to 1x without anything in between. You also don't have a few of the shooting modes because most likely the chip just can't handle it. And so things like that is where you start missing out. So if someone that is looking for a decent camera experience at a budget price, getting a budget phone still just isn't the answer. So when going down the list and comparing the two phones, it's pretty clear why I see this trend on Amazon, and I'm all for it. One, you're kind of saving the planet because you're not throwing away all of the electronics in it, even though you're still getting a new battery, so whatever. But you're also gonna get the better features, you're gonna get a better software experience. Just overall, it's gonna be a better experience. The only thing I can really give the point to on the budget phone is the 5000 milliamp hour battery and overall battery life. If all you really care to do is send messages and make calls, maybe your YouTube videos too, the A16 is not gonna be a bad choice, but for anything else, I would choose the S20. In fact, even for those things, I would choose the S20 because I can't stand the slowness of the OS. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you feel the same way I do, in which I'd rather get a older renewed phone than a ultra budget phone? And if so, what would be your phone of choice? I do have affiliate links in the description. None of them are gonna be for these phones, but they're gonna be for the other phones that I've reviewed so far. Using those affiliate links will really help the channel out and help me keep going and getting more phones to review. So I appreciate it if you do, and if you don't, still appreciate you watching. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.